The ship creaked. Not the normal creak of timber under sail, the familiar groan of wood flexing with waves that sailors knew like breathing. This was different. This was the sound of wood warping under the weight of too many corpses stacked in the hold, layer upon layer of bodies that shouldn't be there. Bodies that were supposed to be buried at sea, but there were too many, always too many, and the crew was too sick to keep up with the dying. The smell hit before the visual. Rotting flesh mixed with seawater mixed with the acrid stench of fierce sweat from the few surviving sailors who knew what they were carrying, who understood that every hour they remained on this ship brought them closer to joining the corpses below. The 12 Genoese galleys leaving Caffa in October 1347 weren't just carrying silk and spices and gold and the luxuries that made Italian merchants wealthy beyond imagining. They were carrying death. Plague-infected rats in every hold, breeding in the darkness between cargo bales, their fleas gorged on infected blood, ready to jump to any warm body that came near. Dying sailors on every deck, black buboes swelling in their groins and armpits like grotesque fruit, fever burning through them so intensely their skin felt like fire to touch, delirium making them scream and thrash and see demons that weren't there. And a destination: Messina, Sicily. Then Genoa. Home. Safety. Escape from the nightmare-consuming Caffa. A journey that would transform the Mediterranean's busiest trade routes into the highways of apocalypse, that would kill 200 million people across 3 continents in 6 years, that would end the medieval world and birth the Renaissance from the ashes of civilizational collapse. October 1347. The world was connected in ways it had never been before and wouldn't be again for 500 years. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes connecting East and West, China to Constantinople, the Pacific to the Mediterranean, the courts of emperors to the marketplaces of merchants, had been humanity's greatest achievement in connectivity. For centuries, caravans carried silk that shimmered like water, spices that transformed European cuisine, gold that filled royal treasuries, porcelain so delicate it seemed magical, precious stones that adorned crowns and churches, and ideas that would reshape civilizations. Marco Polo had traveled these routes 70 years earlier, returning with tales of Kublai Khan's court that Europeans found barely believable. Cities with populations exceeding anything in Europe, wealth beyond European imagination, technologies like paper money and gunpowder that seemed like sorcery. The Mongol Empire's Pax Mongolica had made travel safer than ever before in history. Merchants moved freely under Mongol protection from Korea to Hungary. Bandits were suppressed with ruthless efficiency. The Mongols didn't negotiate with raiders, they exterminated them. Roads were maintained to standards Europe wouldn't match for centuries. Caravanserais provided rest, supplies, and security at regular intervals along every major route. Cities along the routes prospered beyond historical precedent. Samarkand, Constantinople, Venice, Genoa. These cities grew wealthy facilitating trade, taking their cut of every transaction, providing services to merchants traveling thousands of miles. Cultures mixed in ways unprecedented in human history. Persian Muslims traded with Italian Christians, who traded with Chinese Buddhists, who traded with Indian Hindus. Knowledge spread faster than ever before. Mathematical concepts from India, including the zero that would revolutionize European mathematics, reached Europe via Islamic scholars. Chinese inventions like gunpowder, the compass, and printing technology spread westward, eventually transforming European warfare, navigation, and scholarship. Arabic astronomy and medicine, far more advanced than European science, influenced the first European universities. Wealth flowed in all directions, enriching everyone connected to the network. The medieval world had achieved a level of globalization that wouldn't be matched again until steamships and telegraphs created similar connectivity in the 19th century, 500 years later. But that connectivity had a dark side that nobody understood. The same routes that carried silk also carried rats. The same ships that transported spices transported fleas. The same caravans that moved gold moved bacteria. Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, had been circulating in Central Asian rodent populations for millennia, possibly since the Neolithic period when humans first started farming and creating dense settlements that attracted rodents. Genetic analysis of ancient plague DNA extracted from medieval victims' teeth suggests the bacterium evolved approximately 20,000 years ago from Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, a relatively harmless intestinal pathogen that causes mild food poisoning. Over 20,000 years, through countless mutations and natural selection in rodent populations, Yersinia pestis evolved into one of the deadliest pathogens in Earth's history. It developed the ability to block flea digestive systems, turning fleas into desperate disease-spreading machines. It evolved to survive in mammalian blood, evading immune systems with molecular tricks that scientists are still studying today. It developed the capacity to overwhelm immune responses with explosive speed, progressing from infection to death in 72 hours. But for most of its evolutionary history, plague remained confined to wild rodent populations in Central Asia, marmots in Mongolia, ground squirrels in Kazakhstan, various burrowing species that served as reservoir hosts maintaining the disease indefinitely. Plague would circulate through these populations in natural cycles, killing some individuals, sparing others who developed immunity, maintaining itself at endemic levels without ever spreading beyond its reservoir. Occasionally plague would spill over into human populations. There are records of plague-like diseases in ancient China dating back 2,000 years, ancient India, possibly ancient Egypt, though the evidence is disputed. But these were localized outbreaks, limited in geographic spread, eventually burning out when they exhausted local susceptible populations. Plague had never spread globally because global connections didn't exist. Not in ancient times. Not in early medieval times. Not until the Mongol Empire created those connections in the 13th and 14th centuries. And plague exploited them with ruthless efficiency that killed 200 million people in 6 years. Before we trace plague's path across 3 continents, and trust me, we're going city by city, route by route, ship by ship, death toll by death toll, following every merchant who fled infection and every refugee who carried plague unknowingly and every ship that docked in ports thinking they were safe. Comment where you're watching from. Because the route we're about to follow might have passed directly through your city. Might have killed your ancestors' neighbors. Might have depopulated your hometown in 1348 or 1349 or 1350. Plague reached almost every corner of the connected world between 1347 and 1353. If you're European, Asian, Middle Eastern, or North African, your ancestors either survived this pandemic or died from it. There's literally no third option. Every family line that exists today survived the Black Death. Which means someone in your ancestry was immune or lucky or isolated enough to avoid infection when everyone around them was dying. Comment your location. Let's see if plague passed through your homeland. Let's map which cities were hit worst. Let's understand that this isn't ancient history disconnected from your life. This is your history, written in the bodies of your ancestors who survived when 200 million around them died. The journey begins at Kaffa, though not with plague's ultimate origin. Plague originated somewhere in Central Asia, possibly in China's Yunnan province where plague still exists in rodent populations today, possibly in Mongolia where marmots serve as reservoir hosts, possibly in the foothills of the Himalayas where multiple rodent species maintain plague. The exact location remains debated by historians and epidemiologists who analyze genetic evidence from plague DNA. What's certain is that plague was circulating along Silk Road trade routes by the 1330s, killing people in Central Asian cities, spreading through merchant caravans, moving westward with trade. Chinese records describe devastating epidemics in the 1330s and 1340s. One Chinese source claims 5 million died in a single province, though medieval population estimates are notoriously unreliable. The Mongol Empire was experiencing plague outbreaks across its vast territories. Merchants and armies were spreading plague along trade routes connecting east and west. And eventually, inevitably, plague reached Kaffa in 1346. That Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, the western terminus of the Silk Road where east met west, where Asian goods transferred from caravans to ships, where two worlds collided in pursuit of profit. Kaffa was the perfect location for plague to jump from Asian endemic disease to global pandemic. The city was a hub, a node, a bottleneck where everything passed through. Caravans from Samarkand carrying silk, from India carrying spices, from China carrying porcelain, all ended at Kaffa. Merchants transferred goods to ships bound for Italy, for Constantinople, for ports across the Mediterranean. Kaffa was the choke point where continental trade routes met maritime trade routes, where land-based commerce transitioned to sea-based commerce. The geographical position that made Kaffa wealthy made it the perfect location for plague to spread globally via ships that could carry disease faster and farther than any caravan. In September 1346, plague appeared in the Mongol army besieging Kaffa. Khan Janibeg's 20,000 soldiers started dying by the thousands from disease that turned their lymph nodes into swollen black masses the size of apples, that rotted their flesh while they still breathed, that made them scream in agony as their bodies destroyed themselves from within, that killed them within 3 days of first fever. The siege was collapsing as men deserted or died or simply refused to follow orders from commanders who couldn't protect them from invisible death. And Janibeg made history's first biological warfare decision: catapult plague corpses over Kaffa's 30-foot walls. Whether that tactic actually spread plague is debatable. Modern epidemiology suggests corpses probably weren't effective transmission vectors because fleas abandon cooling bodies within hours of death. What's not debatable is that plague entered Kaffa through the natural mechanism it always uses: rats. Thousands of rats infested both the Mongol camp and Kaffa itself. Rats from the camp infiltrated the city, climbing walls, swimming moats, squeezing through gaps in fortifications. The fleas on those rats carried Yersinia pestis. By October 1347, plague was epidemic inside Kaffa. Thousands were dead. More were dying daily at accelerating rates that suggested exponential growth. The hospitals were overwhelmed within days. The streets filled with corpses faster than burial teams could remove them. Mass graves were dug outside the walls, enormous pits where bodies were thrown by the hundreds. The city was lost. Not to Mongol military conquest, but to disease that the Mongols themselves were dying from at equal or greater rates. The Genoese made the only rational decision: flee. If Kaffa was lost to plague, save what could be saved and evacuate to safety. Load whatever cargo remained valuable. Get the survivors on ships. Return to Genoa where presumably the plague hadn't reached yet. Escape from the nightmare before everyone died. 12 galleys loaded hastily in mid-October 1347, sailors working frantically to load cargo and passengers and get away before plague consumed everyone. They loaded silk bales worth fortunes, sacks of spices that would sell for gold in Italian markets, whatever valuables could be grabbed quickly and brought aboard. They loaded passengers, merchants who had been trapped in Kaffa during the siege, officials from the Genoese colonial administration, family members of the garrison. And unknowingly, inevitably, they loaded rats. Infected rats whose fleas carried plague bacteria, rats that had boarded the ships during loading operations, that hid in dark corners between cargo bales where humans wouldn't look, that would breed during the voyage, producing more rats and more fleas and more vectors for disease transmission. The ships had become floating plague incubators, sealed environments where disease could spread efficiently among crew and passengers with nowhere to flee. Death ships that would seed outbreaks at every port they touched for the next 6 months. The crews were infected before departure or during the first days of sailing. Sailors developed fever during loading or shortly after leaving Kaffa's harbor. Within days of departure, men were dying on deck, their bodies covered in the characteristic black buboes that gave the Black Death its name. The captains faced impossible decisions that would haunt the survivors. Throw the bodies overboard with minimal ceremony and maintain sailing speed toward safety. Or stop to conduct proper Christian burials and waste precious time while more men sickened and died. They chose speed over piety. The bodies were thrown overboard, weighted down with rocks or lengths of chain, consigned to the Black Sea depths without last rites or prayers. But it didn't matter because more men sickened every day. More men died every day. The death rate accelerated as the voyage continued. By the time the fleet reached Constantinople 2 weeks later, perhaps half the original crews were dead and half the survivors showed symptoms. The ships were floating morgues where the dying tended the dead and waited to join them. First stop, Constantinople in late October 1347. The capital of the Byzantine Empire, the greatest city in Christendom east of Rome, strategically positioned where Europe meets Asia at the Bosporus Strait. Population perhaps 400,000, making it the largest city in Europe and possibly the largest city west of China. The Genoese ships reached Constantinople's harbor and some stayed only briefly, perhaps a few days, just long enough to resupply with fresh water and food and transfer some cargo before continuing west toward Italy. The Byzantine authorities probably inspected the ships and noticed the dead and dying crew members. They probably ordered quarantine. But it was too late. More than too late. Rats had already disembarked during the loading and unloading operations that happened even during quarantine because cargo had to move and commerce had to continue. Fleas spread from ship rats to Constantinople's enormous urban rat population that numbered in the millions. Within weeks, plague was epidemic in Constantinople. The Byzantine chronicler Nikephoros Gregoras, who survived and wrote extensive accounts of the pandemic, described streets filled with corpses that the living couldn't bury fast enough because grave diggers were dying at the same rate as everyone else. He described hospitals overflowing with dying patients lying in corridors and doorways because all beds were full and there was no space left. He described mass graves dug outside the city walls, enormous pits where bodies were thrown by the hundreds without ceremony or individual burial, layered with quicklime to accelerate decomposition and prevent disease spread through miasma, though of course miasma theory was wrong and the quicklime probably did nothing. He estimated that 9/10 of Constantinople's population died, which is almost certainly trauma-induced exaggeration. Modern historians analyzing property records and tax documents estimate mortality was more likely 30 to 50%, which is still catastrophic. 120,000 to 200,000 deaths in a city of 400,000 over 6 months. The Byzantine Empire never recovered from this demographic blow. Plague returned repeatedly in subsequent decades, killing thousands each time. Constantinople's population collapsed from 400,000 to perhaps 100,000 by 1400. Byzantine military power declined as soldier recruitment became impossible. Byzantine economic power evaporated as trade networks collapsed. When the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, more than a century later, they were conquering a city already destroyed by plague, a shadow of its former glory, a ghost of the great capital that had ruled the eastern Mediterranean for 1,000 years and preserved Roman and Greek knowledge through the Dark Ages. But plague didn't stop at Constantinople. It couldn't stop because Constantinople was connected to everywhere. From the Byzantine capital, plague spread in multiple directions simultaneously, following every trade route that connected Constantinople to the medieval world. South to Alexandria and Egypt following maritime trade routes that had existed for millennia. West to Greece and the Balkans, and eventually Italy following both maritime and overland routes. North into the Black Sea ports of the Crimea and Ukraine, and eventually Russia following routes that connected Constantinople to the Mongol territories. The Silk Road's western terminus had become the epicenter of pandemic disease. Every trade route became a death highway. Every ship became a plague vector. Every merchant became an unwitting carrier of apocalypse. The connectivity that had made Constantinople wealthy and powerful became the mechanism of its destruction. Let's follow the southern route first. South to Egypt. By autumn 1347, possibly November though exact dates are disputed, plague reached Alexandria via merchant ships sailing from Constantinople. Alexandria was one of the Mediterranean's busiest ports, the gateway to Egypt and North Africa, a city of perhaps 100,000 residents that served as the transfer point where Mediterranean maritime trade met overland trade routes into Africa and Arabia. Trade between Constantinople and Alexandria was constant. Grain from Egypt fed Constantinople, luxury goods from Asia flowed through both cities. A single merchant ship carried plague from Constantinople to Alexandria. Just one ship among hundreds that sailed that route annually. Within weeks of the ship's arrival, Alexandria was experiencing epidemic disease. The Arab historian al-Makrizi, writing decades later based on eyewitness accounts, described symptoms matching bubonic plague perfectly. Massive swellings in the groin and armpits that turned black and burst, fever so intense victims felt they were burning alive, delirium making people see demons and angels, death within days. He wrote that the death toll was so high that the living couldn't bury the dead at anywhere near the required rate. Bodies lay in streets for days, rotting in the Mediterranean heat, creating health hazards and overwhelming the senses. Mass graves were dug but filled faster than gravediggers could dig new ones. The city's infrastructure began to collapse as workers died and no one replaced them. From Alexandria, plague spread along multiple routes like water flowing downhill. West along the African coast to Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, following maritime trade routes that connected Mediterranean ports. South up the Nile River to Cairo, following the river route that had connected Upper and Lower Egypt since pharaonic times. East along caravan routes to Arabia and the Holy Land, following ancient trade paths. Every route became a vector. Every traveler became a carrier. By summer 1348, plague reached Cairo, capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, cultural center of the Islamic world, largest city in the Mediterranean basin with perhaps 600,000 residents, making it larger than any European city. The child Sultan an-Nasir Hassan fled the city with his court, abandoning Cairo to plague and chaos. The Egyptian chronicler Ibn Ayyas recorded that corpses filled the streets so completely that movement became difficult. More than one-third of Cairo's population died, 200,000 people in 6 months. The Mamluk military, already weakened by succession crises and political instability, lost thousands of soldiers and couldn't recruit replacements. Mamluk power declined permanently and irreversibly. The Islamic world's political center began shifting from Cairo to the emerging Ottoman Empire based in Constantinople and later Istanbul. Now watch this. Comment below, evil or just commerce? Because here's what happened. Plague continued spreading through the Middle East and North Africa with devastating thoroughness over the next 2 years. In April 1347, even before reaching Constantinople, plague had somehow reached Gaza via overland routes from the north. Possibly from Constantinople, possibly from Asian trade routes, the records are unclear. By July 1347, Damascus was infected and experiencing epidemic conditions. By October 1347, Aleppo, the cities of the Levant, Ascalon, Acre, Jerusalem, Sidon, Tyre, Homs, Hama, all infected by the end of 1347. These were major trade cities on routes connecting Egypt to Anatolia to Arabia. Plague spread to all of them within months. In 1348 to 1349, plague reached Antioch and spread through Anatolia. The city's residents fled north towards safer territories, carrying plague with them embedded in their clothing and belongings and the rats that followed refugee caravans. Most died during the journey, creating a trail of bodies along the roads. Within 2 years of reaching Alexandria, plague had spread throughout the entire Islamic world from Arabia across North Africa to Morocco, from Egypt through the Levant to Anatolia and Persia. The death toll was catastrophic and comparable to Europe's suffering. Islamic sources suggest mortality rates matching European estimates, 1/3 to 1/2 of populations. Some regions suffered worse. Syria possibly lost 60% of its population. Egypt's population declined from perhaps 8 million to 5 million, a loss of 3 million people. Iraq lost comparable proportions. The Islamic Golden Age, which had preserved and advanced knowledge during Europe's Dark Ages, ended in the plague years. The great libraries, the universities, the scientific institutions, all were devastated by loss of scholars and students and patrons. But the route that would prove most consequential for world history led west from Constantinople to Sicily and Italy. The 12 Genoese galleys that fled Kaffa didn't all stop at Constantinople. Most continued west through the Aegean Sea, past the Greek islands, heading home to Italy as fast as sails and winds allowed. In October 1347, probably late October based on sailing times, the fleet reached Messina in northeastern Sicily. By that point, most crew members were dead or dying and the ships were barely functional. Contemporary accounts describe ships arriving at Messina with corpses on deck, dying men in the hold, and rats everywhere. Visible rats running across cargo, unusual enough that witnesses mentioned it specifically. The citizens of Messina didn't immediately realize the danger because plague was unknown in Italy and no one understood disease transmission. They allowed the ships to dock at the city's harbor. They unloaded cargo that was still valuable despite the dead crews. They traded with the few surviving sailors, buying silk and spices at bargain prices from men desperate to sell and flee. And plague entered Sicily. The spread through Sicily was rapid and catastrophic beyond anything recorded in European history to that point. Messina was infected by November 1347. By December, the entire island was experiencing epidemic disease. The contemporary Italian chronicler Michele de Piazza, who witnessed events firsthand, wrote detailed descriptions that remain chilling to read 7 centuries later. He wrote that victims developed fist-sized swellings in the groin and armpits, that blood and pus oozed from the buboes creating a stench that filled entire houses, that patients died within 3 days of first symptoms with mortality rates approaching 100% among those who showed symptoms. He described mass burials in pits dug hastily outside cities, abandoned homes with corpses rotting inside because no one dared enter to retrieve bodies, deserted streets where only rats moved freely among the dead. He claimed that 3/4 of Sicily's population died in 6 months, though modern demographic analysis suggests 1/3 to 1/2 is more accurate. Even at the lower estimate, Sicily lost perhaps 300,000 to 500,000 people in 6 months out of a pre-plague population of perhaps 800,000. Some villages were completely depopulated. Some cities lost 90% of their populations. The island's economy collapsed as workers died and production ceased and trade stopped because no one would trade with plague-infected Sicily. From Sicily, plague spread to the Italian mainland via the constant maritime trade connecting the island to major ports. Genoa and Venice were infected by January 1348 when ships from Kaffa finally completed their journey home. The irony was bitter and obvious to contemporaries who wrote about it. The Genoese were fleeing plague, seeking safety in their home city, and they brought the catastrophe with them. Genoa lost perhaps half its population over the next year, perhaps 50,000 deaths out of 100,000 residents. Venice lost similar proportions. The great maritime republics that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries, that had grown wealthy connecting east and west, were devastated by the very trade routes that had enriched them. Their populations collapsed. Their trade networks disrupted. Their wealth evaporated as commerce ceased and workers died, and no one was left to maintain the economic engine that had made them powerful. Pisa was infected a few weeks after Genoa and Venice, becoming the entry point for plague into northern Italy and Tuscany. From Pisa, plague spread rapidly through Tuscany along well-traveled roads connecting major cities, reaching Florence by March 1348. The death toll in Florence was catastrophic and meticulously documented. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived and wrote the Decameron during the plague years, provided detailed eyewitness accounts of Florence's suffering. He described streets filled with corpses that no one would touch. He described families abandoned by their servants who fled to the countryside seeking safety. He described children orphaned when parents died within days of each other, left to starve because no one would take them in for fear of contagion. He described wealthy families reduced to poverty when breadwinners died. He described the collapse of social order as people abandoned all customs and lived only for immediate pleasure knowing death could come tomorrow. Modern demographic research using tax records and property documents suggests Florence lost 50,000 to 60,000 of its 120,000 residents. Half the city dead in 6 months. The economic and cultural capital of Tuscany, one of Europe's wealthiest and most advanced cities, reduced to a ghost town where survivors walked streets lined with empty houses. The final major entry point into Western Europe came at Marseille in southern France. One of the galleys expelled from multiple Italian ports, probably because authorities recognized the ship carried plague and refused entry, arrived at Marseille in late January 1348. The city authorities quarantined the ship, refusing to allow cargo unloading or crew disembarkation. But quarantine didn't work because it couldn't work. Rats don't respect quarantine. They swim. They climb. They infiltrate. Rats left the quarantined ship and reached Marseille's docks and spread into the city proper. Within weeks, plague was epidemic in Marseille. By February 1348, bodies filled the streets. By March, plague was spreading inland along France's trade routes, north up the Rhône Valley toward Lyon and Paris, west along overland routes toward Toulouse and Bordeaux and the Atlantic coast. France would ultimately lose approximately 1/3 of its population over the next 2 years. Perhaps 8 million deaths out of a pre-plague population of 24 million. 8 million individual deaths, each one a human tragedy, each one destroying a family and community. The scale of death was so enormous it changed French society permanently. Labor became scarce and valuable. Wages tripled. Serfs demanded freedom. The feudal system began its slow collapse that would culminate in the French Revolution 4 centuries later. Now here's my second question for you. Drop your answer in the comments. Could any of this have been stopped? If Constantinople or Messina or Marseille had refused all ships from infected areas, if they'd enforced absolute maritime quarantine, if they'd burned ships at sea without allowing them near ports, could plague have been contained? Or was pandemic inevitable once plague entered the interconnected trading world of 1347? Your answer reveals something important about how you think about pandemic response, about individual decisions versus systemic vulnerabilities, about whether we can ever really stop global disease spread when we depend on global trade. Comment below. Let's debate this because it matters today as much as it mattered in 1347. From southern France, plague spread in multiple directions simultaneously following every trade route radiating from Marseille. North toward Paris along the Rhône Valley, following river trade that connected Mediterranean ports to northern France. West toward Bordeaux and the Atlantic coast, following overland routes. South into Spain across the Pyrenees, following mountain passes that connected France to Iberia. The mechanisms of spread were consistent everywhere: trade routes, merchant travel, refugee movement. Merchants fled infected cities and carried plague to new markets. Refugees fled plague-devastated regions and brought infection to areas that had been safe. Soldiers moved between conflicts and spread plague to battlefields and garrison towns. Pilgrims traveled to religious sites and created superspreader events at shrines and cathedrals. Every movement, every journey, Every connection became a potential transmission event. Paris was infected by June 1348 along routes from both Marseille and maritime connections to England. The French king Philip VI fled the city with his court, abandoning Paris to plague just as Egypt's sultan had abandoned Cairo. Approximately 50,000 Parisians died out of perhaps 200,000 residents. 1/4 of the population, though some modern estimates suggest mortality may have reached 1/3. The English Channel, which had protected England from continental invasions for centuries, couldn't stop plague. By June 1348, merchant ships from France and the Low Countries brought plague to English ports. Bristol and Southampton were infected by midsummer. Plague spread from these port cities into the English countryside along roads and rivers, reaching London by autumn 1348. The English experience illustrates perfectly how thoroughly plague exploited trade networks and human connectivity. Bristol was a major port trading with France, Ireland, and Iceland. Plague entered through maritime connections from France and spread inland along roads connecting Bristol to Bath, Gloucester, Oxford, eventually London. Southampton traded primarily with France and the Mediterranean. Plague arrived on ships from Marseille and spread along England's southern coast to Portsmouth, Brighton, Dover. London was connected to both Bristol and Southampton via well-traveled inland trade routes. Plague converged on the capital from multiple directions simultaneously, creating overwhelming epidemic conditions where multiple plague strains circulated at once. England lost approximately 1/3 of its population over 1348 to 1350. Perhaps 1.5 to 2 million deaths out of a pre-plague population of 4 to 5 million. Some regions suffered catastrophically worse than the national average. Rural East Anglia experienced 60% mortality in some parishes. London lost perhaps 100,000 of 300,000 residents. Spain was infected from multiple directions, making containment impossible even if authorities had understood disease transmission. Southern Spain received plague from North Africa via maritime trade between Morocco and Andalusian ports like Seville and Granada. Eastern Spain was infected from southern France along Mediterranean coastal routes connecting Barcelona to Marseille. Western Spain was infected from Portugal, which received plague via maritime trade with England and France. The Crown of Aragon, the Crown of Castile, and Portugal all experienced devastating epidemics in 1348 to 1349. The Iberian Peninsula lost approximately 1/3 of its population overall, though regional variation was enormous. Barcelona possibly lost half its residents within 6 months. Seville lost similar proportions. Rural Castile lost 40 to 60% in some regions. The Spanish kingdoms were fighting each other and fighting Islamic Granada when plague arrived, and military campaigns became superspreader events as armies moved and spread infection. From France and Spain, plague spread into the Holy Roman Empire and Central Europe following trade routes connecting Western and Central Europe. German cities along major trade routes were infected by late 1348 and early 1349. Cologne, Mainz, Frankfurt, Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Augsburg, Vienna, all major commercial centers, all experiencing catastrophic epidemics. The German lands possibly lost 1/3 of their population overall, though estimates vary widely due to poor record-keeping compared to Italy and France. Some cities maintained detailed mortality records showing death rates exceeding 50%. Strasbourg lost perhaps 16,000 of 30,000 residents. Vienna lost similar proportions. Rural areas had less documentation but probably suffered comparable or worse mortality because rural housing conditions favored rat infestation and flea transmission. Scandinavia was infected via maritime trade with England and the Low Countries. Norway was the first Scandinavian country to experience plague, infected in May 1349 when a wool ship from England landed at Bergen carrying cloth and rats. Bergen was Norway's largest city and busiest port. Plague spread from Bergen throughout Norway, reaching inland valleys and eventually Arctic regions. Norway's population declined by approximately 1/3, possibly more. The economic and demographic impact was catastrophic and permanent. Norway didn't recover its pre-plague population until the 19th century, 400 years later. The kingdom lost so many people that entire regions were depopulated. Farms were abandoned. Villages emptied. The Norwegian economy collapsed and didn't recover for generations. From Norway, plague spread to Sweden and Denmark via maritime trade routes connecting Scandinavian cities. By 1350, all of Scandinavia was infected and experiencing epidemic conditions. Iceland received plague via ships from Norway and Bergen. The island's isolation didn't protect it because Iceland was connected to Norway through trade. The island lost perhaps half its population within a year. Greenland's Norse settlements may have been completely depopulated, though whether plague or other factors like climate change and supply disruption caused final abandonment remains debated by historians. The far northern reaches of Europe weren't spared despite assumptions that cold climates would prevent plague transmission. Plague reached areas that seemed too cold, too isolated, too far north for epidemic disease. Eastern Europe experienced plague later but no less severely. Plague spread eastward from Germany into Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and eventually Russia, following both trade routes and military movements. Moscow was infected by 1353, 6 years after plague first reached the Mediterranean. The Russian principalities lost perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of their population. The Mongol Golden Horde territories in Central Asia and southern Russia, the same territories that had facilitated plague spread through trade route protection, were themselves devastated. The same Mongol Empire that had created the Pax Mongolica enabling global trade was consumed by plague that traveled those protected routes. Mongol power declined permanently. The political fragmentation of the Mongol Empire accelerated as population losses made governance impossible. By 1353, plague had reached almost every corner of the connected world. From China to Iceland. From Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa. From England to India. Every region connected to the Afro-Eurasian trade network experienced plague. The only major regions spared were the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, regions not yet connected to Afro-Eurasian trade networks and thus protected by isolation. Everywhere else experienced plague. And everywhere, the pattern was identical. Trade routes brought plague, cities suffered worst because urban rat populations facilitated transmission, mortality was catastrophic, societies were permanently transformed. The total death toll is impossible to calculate precisely but certainly exceeded 100 million and possibly reached 200 million, making it the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded history. Europe lost approximately 25 to 50 million of 75 million residents. The Islamic world lost comparable proportions, perhaps 25 million dead. China possibly lost 15 to 20 million, though Chinese records are fragmentary. India lost unknown millions. Central Asia lost millions. The global population declined from approximately 365 million in 1340 to 300 million by 1400. 65 million deaths over 60 years, most concentrated in the 6 years from 1347 to 1353. It remains the deadliest pandemic in human history even when compared to 20th century catastrophes. World War II killed approximately 60 million. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed approximately 50 million. COVID-19 has killed approximately 7 million. The Black Death killed 200 million in a world with 1/20th of today's population. Proportionally, it was humanity's worst catastrophe. But it wasn't just the death toll that mattered. It was how trade routes, humanity's greatest achievement in connectivity, the network that had enriched civilizations and spread knowledge and connected cultures, became death highways. How ships carrying silk also carried rats. How caravans moving spices also moved fleas. How merchants seeking profit unknowingly spread apocalypse. Every connection became a vulnerability. Every trade node became an epicenter. Every prosperous city became a plague pit. The 13 cities with the highest plague outbreak counts between 1347 and 1760 were all major trade nodes: Venice, Genoa, Florence, Milan, Barcelona, Marseille, Paris, London, Cologne, Vienna, Constantinople, Alexandria, Cairo. These cities experienced plague repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times over 4 centuries, because they were connected. Ships arrived daily from dozens of ports. Merchants traveled constantly between trading partners. Prosperity required connectivity. And connectivity guaranteed plague would return. One final call to action. Comment 1347 if you made it this far through this journey of death. And tell me, which city's story should I tell in detail next? Venice's repeated plagues? Cairo's catastrophe? London's multiple epidemics? Florence's cultural collapse and rebirth? I'll make a follow-up video about whichever city gets the most requests. Comment the city name plus 1347 so I can count votes accurately. Let's crowdsource which plague story needs to be told. The lesson is brutal and uncomfortable but essential. The same systems that make us prosperous make us vulnerable. Trade enriches but also endangers. Connection brings prosperity and pandemic. Globalization creates wealth and death highways. We learned this in 1347 when Silk Road trade routes spread plague from Central Asia to Iceland in 6 years. We forgot the lesson because prosperity is seductive and connection feels good and trade makes everyone richer until pandemic arrives. COVID-19 reminded us in 2020 when air routes spread disease from Wuhan to every country on Earth in 3 months. The plague that spread along medieval trade routes killed 200 million. COVID-19 spread along modern air routes and killed millions despite vastly better medicine. Different technologies, different centuries, different pathogens, but same fundamental dynamic. Human connectivity enables disease spread faster than public health systems can respond. And we're making the same choices medieval merchants made. They knew trade spread plague. Italian city-states tried quarantines as early as 1348. Mediterranean ports banned ships from infected areas. Venice developed sophisticated quarantine protocols requiring ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before cargo unloading. The origin of the word quarantine from Italian quarantagiorni, 40 days. It didn't work because economic pressure overcame public health measures every time. Cities needed trade to survive. Merchants needed income to feed families. Populations needed food imports to avoid starvation. So the quarantines were lifted when ships threatened to bypass the port entirely. The economic benefits of trade outweighed the pandemic risks. Until millions died and costs became undeniable. Then quarantines were reimposed temporarily until the epidemic passed and trade resumed and the cycle repeated. We're doing the same now in 2025. We know air travel spreads pandemic disease. We knew before COVID-19. SARS proved it in 2003. Influenza proves it annually as new strains spread globally in weeks. But we maintain global connectivity because economic benefits outweigh perceived risks. We accept pandemic risk as the price of prosperity. International tourism generates trillions. Global supply chains enable modern manufacturing. Cultural exchange enriches societies. The benefits are real and substantial. Until pandemic arrives. Until millions die. Until hospitals overflow and economies shut down and costs become undeniable. Then we implement temporary travel restrictions, contain the outbreak through lockdowns and vaccines, and resume connectivity because prosperity requires it. The cycle continues. The lesson remains unlearned. The trade routes that became death highways in 1347 are still highways in 2025. Different cargo, different speeds, different technologies, but same routes connecting same regions. Silk Road is now Belt and Road Initiative connecting China to Europe via land routes through Central Asia. Genoese galleys are now container ships moving goods between Mediterranean ports and Asian manufacturing centers. Caravans are now trucks and freight trains moving across continents. The connectivity is vastly greater than medieval levels. The trade is exponentially faster. The vulnerabilities are correspondingly larger because disease can spread at jet speed instead of sailing ship speed. And plague still exists. Yersinia pestis didn't go extinct when antibiotics made it treatable. It went dormant in rodent reservoir populations. 2,000 to 3,000 plague cases are reported globally every year, maintained in wild rodent populations across multiple continents. Madagascar has annual plague outbreaks. The Democratic Republic of Congo experiences regular cases. The southwestern United States has plague-infected prairie dog colonies. The bacterium is everywhere, waiting for conditions that favor spillover into human populations. And if antibiotic resistance evolves, and resistance always evolves eventually, plague becomes untreatable again and mortality returns to medieval levels of 60 to 90%. The routes are ready. The rats are ready. The fleas are ready. The bacteria are ready. The infrastructure for pandemic spread is vastly more extensive than anything that existed in 1347. The next plague won't take 6 years to spread from Central Asia to Europe. It will take 6 weeks, maybe 6 days if it spreads via air travel. The death toll won't be limited by slow sailing ships and walking speed caravans. It will be limited only by how fast modern medicine can develop treatments and deploy them globally. And COVID-19 showed that's not fast enough to prevent millions of deaths, even with every resource of modern civilization dedicated to the problem. We can't uninvent trade. Can't disconnect the global economy. Can't eliminate the routes that connect every city to every other city. But we could prepare. We could maintain hospital surge capacity instead of running healthcare systems at maximum efficiency with zero slack. We could stockpile treatments and medical equipment instead of relying on just-in-time supply chains that break during crises. We could fund public health surveillance systems that detect outbreaks early instead of cutting public health budgets during good years. We could enforce regulations on wildlife markets and agricultural practices that create zoonotic spillover risks instead of allowing conditions that enabled SARS and MERS and COVID-19. We could do all these things. The knowledge exists. The technology exists. The wealth exists in developed countries to fund comprehensive pandemic preparedness. We don't do these things because they're expensive, because they don't generate immediate profit. Because pandemic is theoretical risk that seems distant and unlikely until it arrives and kills millions. Because politicians won't fund preparedness that benefits future administrations. Because populations won't support expensive programs for unlikely threats. Because we've learned nothing from 1347 despite 7 centuries of recurring plagues and pandemics. The trade routes that became death highways killed 200 million people between 1347 and 1353. Those same routes, modernized and accelerated and expanded to encompass the entire planet, will kill again. Not if, when. The next plague is coming. Plague is always coming because plague never left. It lives in rodent populations, in bat colonies, in agricultural animals, in wild reservoirs across the planet. It waits for the right mutation, the right environmental conditions, the right moment to spill over into human populations. And when it does, it will spread along the routes we built for prosperity. The highways we paved. The connections we created. The global network we depend on for everything from food to medicine to manufactured goods. The ships still sail. The rats still hide in holes. The fleas still carry bacteria. The trade continues uninterrupted. The routes remain open. The vulnerability persists and grows. We're all traveling the death highways now. We just don't realize it until the pandemic starts. Until millions die. Until the routes we built to carry prosperity carry death instead. The lesson of 1347 wasn't learned. The death highways weren't closed. They were expanded, paved, optimized for speed and efficiency. We trade faster, travel farther, connect more thoroughly than any medieval merchant could imagine. And when the next plague comes, and it will come, plague always comes, it will spread faster than the Black Death, kill more efficiently than medieval pandemics, reach everyone connected to the global network. Which means everyone. The death highways go everywhere now. There's nowhere to flee that isn't connected. Nowhere to hide that trade doesn't reach. Nowhere outside the network. We're all in Messina now. Watching the ships arrive. Smelling the rot. Hearing the dying. Waiting for the plague that's already spreading. The routes brought prosperity for 7 centuries. The routes brought death for 7 centuries. The routes remain open. Forever highways of commerce and catastrophe. Forever connecting and killing. Forever enriching and destroying. The choice between prosperity and pandemic was made in 1347. We chose prosperity. We're still choosing prosperity. And we're still paying the price in millions of deaths every time pandemic arrives. The death highways remain. Forever.